Good evening. My name's Lieutenant Mike McGee, and I'm the officer or pastor at the Salvation Army in Alamance County, North Carolina. And we'd invite you to join us sometime, but tonight we're doing our How We Got Our Bible Bible study series, and we are on part 8. And tonight we're going to start talking about something a little interesting. We're going to do it in 2 parts. We'll start here talking about the Old Testament, and we'll start next week talking about the New Testament. But what we want to talk about tonight, last week and the week before, we talked about how we canonized our Bible, how we decided that certain books should be included in the Bible. This week we want to start talking about the transmission of our Bible, and that is to say how our Bible got passed down through the years, and how can we be sure that we have a good copy? The fact is that there's no original manuscript left. There's no original manuscript where we say, hey, we have the copy of Paul's letters. Those things fall apart and disintegrate over time. And so all we have are copies. And so what we want to know is, how can we be sure that these copies are right? How can we be sure that these copies represent what the original text said? Or even, how can we be sure someone didn't add something to these copies? And so that's what we want to start talking about tonight. And we're going to start by talking about the Old Testament. And we have to go way back to the beginning and talk about how the Old Testament was originally passed down from generation to generation. And it started with a group of people known as the scribes. And the scribes' job, they kind of had 2 roles. Role number 1 was to copy down the law of Moses originally, just copy down that law and make new copies of it. And then the other job of the scribe was to read it, to stand up and read it in front of people. And so that was kind of the role of the scribe. And even in Jesus' day, you see that he's still dealing with, it'll talk about scribes and teachers of the law and people that come up and deal with Jesus. And so the scribes are the people that are in charge of making copies of God's word. The Jewish Talmud, which came along a little later, actually requires that all copies of the law of Moses, that they be written on animal skin rolls, which is actually a rule that's still in effect for the Jewish community. That's how you copy and transmit the law onto animal skin rolls. All copying, this is important, we're going to talk about who came after the scribes next, but an important note is that all copies of everything, if you wanted a copy of anything, it had to be done by hand until the year 1456, which is, of course, when the printing press is invented by Gutenberg. And so all of a sudden now there's a printing press and we can make copies of the Bible, and that's a beautiful thing. But until 1456 AD, anything you wanted to transmit had to be copied by hand. And so the Jewish people had a process to transmit the Old Testament, and that was for scribes to copy it by hand. After scribes, around 500 AD and lasting until about 1000 AD, there was a group called the Masoretes that rose up. That's Masoretes, I think, Masoretes. And the Masoretes became the group that was in charge of copying the Bible, and they dedicated themselves to doing it. And the Masoretes were dedicated to accuracy, so much so that they counted the number of letters in any given Hebrew text. And as they worked through copying the Old Testament, they would actually go and find the middle letter of every text so that they could know that the book had been copied correctly by saying this letter is supposed to be directly in the middle. And so they were into accuracy, and they were into counting the letters to make sure that every book they put out had the right number of letters in it. The Masoretes do something interesting and helpful, I think, for us, but the Masoretes introduce vowel points to the Hebrew Old Testament. So prior to the Masoretes coming along, original Hebrew, it was written without vowels. In fact, there were no vowels in the Hebrew alphabet at all. And so the Masoretes come along and say, okay, we've invented 3 vowel points that can be stuck into words to help you understand and make out what the word is supposed to be. But I've brought an example of what a text might look like. I'm hoping you can see that I'm holding it at a level that you can see it. Now this is kind of showing the English feel of what the old Hebrew texts would have looked like to the Masoretes who were in charge of copying it. And I want to give you a second here to look at it and see if you can figure out what it says. You're even welcome if you'd like to copy and take a guess before I tell you. But I'm going to jump in and tell you now. The answer is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's a tough thing to read. Maybe you got it, maybe you didn't get it, but to read that without vowels is a tough thing to do. And that's what the old Hebrew texts looked like in Hebrew. There were no vowels, there were no spaces, everything ran together. And so the Masoretes introduced the idea of vowels. And so the newly copied forms of the Hebrew Old Testament, now including vowel points, is called the Masoretic text. And even today, as scholars look at translating the Bible and things like that, something to always consider is the Masoretic text and the way they kind of rendered things and where they put the vowels and what that means about how they thought it should be understood. But that's the Masoretic text, and for a long time, the Masoretic text was the best copy of the Hebrew Old Testament we had. Even when our favorite books, like the King James Bible, were translated, the Masoretic text was maybe one of the best copies of the Hebrew Old Testament we had. And so the thing we have to figure out is, well, how accurate are these texts? In 1947, there was a shepherd boy who was out in an area that we now call Qumran. And Qumran used to be a kind of like a monastery in the 1st century. And in Qumran, this little boy in 1947 comes along, and now it's just desert. It's just, there's nothing out here. And this little boy is looking for a sheep, and he starts throwing rocks into these caves up above him. And he throws a rock into one of the caves, and he hears something break. And his rock that he threw into the cave, it actually broke a jar. And so the little boy goes and looks, and in the jar he finds papers. He finds text, things that are written down in ancient languages. And so it ends up that in that first cave where this little boy threw this rock, they pull out in 1947 a full copy of Isaiah. But this full copy of Isaiah is critically important for the church, for us today, but for the church in 1947, because the oldest prior manuscript, the oldest prior copy we had of the Old Testament came from around 900 AD. That was the oldest copy we had. And, that was probably from the Masoretes. But this 900 AD was the oldest copy we have. This scroll of Isaiah they find in 1947 is dated to 125 BC. It is nearly 1,000 years older than our most recent text. And so there's one thing, we're going to look at this in a little more detail in a second, but one thing that's important to note, hey, we've been working off this Masoretic text to understand the Old Testament, to see if we feel like we have a good copy of the Old Testament. And now all of a sudden we have something 1,000 years earlier. And so if those two copies are close together and match each other really well, then we feel really good about how the Bible has been transmitted and passed down and copied from generation to generation. But if those two texts are different, if they disagree, if they have wildly different things in them, then we'd say, I don't know that the Bible was translated or transmitted super accurately. And so it's really important how the Masoretic text is going to compare to this copy of Isaiah that's found in 1947. So since then, and we're going to talk about how they compare in a second, but since then, about 800 more documents have been recovered from Qumran, from surrounding caves, as they've gone and looked for other things. And they have found copies of every Old Testament book in part or in whole, with the exception of Esther. Every Old Testament book, they find a copy of it in Qumran. And all these things are dated to 125 BC. And so they find these copies, and we've got basically the whole Old Testament to look at. And we can now say, well, how does the Masoretic text compare to the Dead Sea Scrolls text in accuracy? We found a text that's 1,000 years older. How do they compare? And across the board, we find that the Masoretic text is strikingly accurate, that the Masoretic text closely agrees with what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so there's always little things you can find where, oh, maybe this could have been translated a little different, or maybe we would have broken this up differently. And there are little things we can find like that. But for the most part, they agree. They 99% agree. And so that's why more modern translations of the Bible will rely more on the things we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and older versions of the Bible rely more on the Masoretic text. But a really important thing for us, and the thing I want to communicate to you tonight, is how can we be sure? We've had copies of copies for generations. How can we be sure that what we have is accurate? And we feel really good about the accuracy of our Old Testament because we had a copy we used for like 1,000 years. It was a copy we used. And then we found a copy that was 1,000 years older, and they matched. And so we can look at our Old Testament text and feel very confident that as the scribes and then the Masoretes transmit that to us through the generation, they took exceeding care to make sure that what they were transmitting was accurate. And that's why we have confidence in the texts that we have received. That's what I've got for you tonight. We're going to pick up next week talking about the New Testament. We'd love to have your comments, thoughts, questions, anything like that. And God bless you, and we'll see you next time.